you think you already know where trees come from. And the reason you feel so certain about it is because you've seen the process play out so many times that it no longer feels like something worth questioning. A seed goes into the ground. You water it. You wait. And eventually something green pushes its way up through the soil, stretching toward the light, as if that upward motion alone explains everything. Over time, that small, fragile sprout thickens, expands, and transforms into something solid and enormous. And because the entire process visibly begins in the ground, you naturally conclude that the ground must be where the tree comes from. And I want you to notice something very carefully here, because this is the kind of detail people usually ignore without realizing it. You are not just observing what happens, you are unconsciously constructing an explanation that feels complete simply because it matches what you see. The roots go down, the trunk goes up, and your mind quietly fills in the missing mechanism with a story that sounds reasonable enough that you never feel the need to test it. Trees come from the ground. It's simple, intuitive, and most importantly, it feels true. But I want you to slow down and stay with me for a moment, because what we're about to do is not complicated. It just requires that you stop accepting the first explanation your brain gives you and actually look at what that explanation is claiming. If you say that a tree comes from the ground, then you are making a physical statement, not a poetic one, which means you are saying that the material of the tree, the wood, the bark, the branches, the entire solid structure is somehow derived from the soil beneath it. Now, instead of letting that idea sit comfortably in the background, I want you to bring it into focus and examine it as if you've never heard it before. Imagine a fully grown tree, something large enough that you could build a house from it or sit in its shade for hours. Something that feels undeniably solid and heavy. And then ask yourself where all of that material actually came from in a literal, physical sense. That tree was not always there. At some point, it existed as a tiny seed. Something so small you could lose it in your hand without noticing. And yet over time, it became thousands of pounds of real matter. So here's the question. And I don't want you to answer it quickly, because the speed of your answer is exactly what hides the problem. Where did all of that mass come from? Not in a general way, not in a biological sense, but in terms of actual atoms and actual weight. If the tree now weighs thousands of pounds, then those thousands of pounds had to come from somewhere. And whatever explanation you accept has to account for that completely. Your instinct will try to pull you back toward the ground, because that's the picture you've always had. But now you have to follow that idea all the way through instead of stopping halfway. If the tree comes from the ground, then the ground must be losing material as the tree grows, because matter doesn't just appear out of nowhere. That means, over time, the soil should be disappearing, turning into trunk and branches and leaves. And if that were really the case, you would expect to see the ground around large trees gradually hollowing out as their mass increases. But that's not what you see. You walk through forests. You stand next to massive trees, and the ground looks essentially the same as it always has. There are no enormous voids where tons of soil have been converted into wood. No visible evidence that the earth is being consumed in proportion to the size of the tree. And yet the tree is undeniably there, solid and heavy, with a mass that has to be accounted for, whether you think about it or not. So now something subtle but important has happened in your thinking. The explanation that once felt obvious is no longer stable, because when you push it to its logical conclusion, it stops matching reality. And this is the moment where most people quietly step away. Not because the problem is too hard, but because it feels easier to keep the familiar idea than to admit that they don't actually understand what's going on. But you're not going to do that. Because if you stay with the question just a little longer, you start to realize that what looked like a simple story is actually missing something fundamental. You are looking at a massive object that clearly gained its mass over time. And the explanation you've been carrying does not fully explain where that mass came from. And once you see that clearly, you can't unsee it, because now the question is no longer optional. Wait, that's not optional. That's required, because matter has to be conserved. You can't just create thousands of pounds of material without taking it from somewhere. Now stop and think about what that would actually look like in the real world. Not in your imagination, but in something you could observe. If a tree gains 10, 0.000 pounds over time, then the soil around it should lose 10, 0.000 pounds, which is an enormous amount. That would mean the ground should visibly shrink, sink, or hollow out as the tree grows. And large forests would leave behind massive deficits in the earth beneath them. But that's not what you see. You can walk through a forest that has existed for hundreds of years, stand next to trees that have been growing for decades, even centuries, and the ground is still there, stable and largely unchanged in any obvious way. There are no giant cavities forming under trees. No evidence that tons of soil have been converted into wood and lifted upward into trunks and branches. So now the problem becomes quantitative, not just intuitive. You are not just slightly off in your understanding. You are off by thousands of pounds. And that's the kind of error you cannot ignore if you're trying to understand how the physical world actually works. This is the moment where vague explanations stop being useful. Because when you attach numbers to the problem, they force you to confront whether your idea is even possible. And right now, your idea is not holding up. You might try to soften it to say that maybe not all of the mass comes from the ground. Maybe just part of it does. But that doesn't really solve anything. Because even if you reduce the claim, you still have to account for the majority of that 10, 000 pounds, and you still need a source that can supply that much material. And this is where most people quietly give up on the question. Not because it's impossible to answer, but because it's uncomfortable to realize that something so familiar is not actually understood. They retreat into phrases like nutrients or absorption without asking what those words physically mean or how much mass they actually represent. But you're not going to do that, because if you stay with the problem, if you keep asking where the mass comes from and refuse to accept an answer that doesn't fully account for it, then you start to see that something is missing in your picture of reality. Something fundamental about how matter moves and transforms. You are looking at a 10, 000 pound object, and your current explanation cannot tell you where those 10,000 pounds originated. And that's not a small gap in your understanding. That's a hole you can't ignore anymore, because now you know the question is real, and you still don't have the answer. Now, instead of guessing, instead of arguing from what feels right, we're going to do something much more dangerous to your intuition, which is to actually measure what happens and see whether your explanation survives contact with reality. Because up to this point, you've been relying on a picture in your head. And the problem with pictures in your head is that they don't have to obey the laws of physics unless you force them to. So let me show you an experiment, a very old one. But that's part of what makes it so powerful, because it doesn't rely on modern technology or complicated theory. It relies on something much simpler: careful observation and a scale. A man named Jan Baptist van Helmont, working in the 1600s, asked essentially the same question you're now facing, although he didn't phrase it in quite the same way. He wanted to know what plants are actually made of, not in a vague philosophical sense, but in a physical sense that you could test. So he designed an experiment that was almost brutally straightforward. He took a young willow tree, small enough that he could weigh it, and it came out to about 5 pounds. Then he took a large amount of soil, around 200 pounds of it, dried it completely so that water wouldn't interfere with the measurement, and weighed that as well. At this point, everything in the system had a known mass, and nothing was left ambiguous. Then he planted the tree in that soil. And here's the critical part that you need to pay attention to, because this is what turns it into a real test instead of just an observation. He controlled what went into the system. He didn't add extra soil later. He didn't mix in unknown substances. He simply watered the plant over time and let it grow, making sure that the only significant input besides the original soil was water. Now I want you to imagine the passage of time here, not as something compressed into a few seconds, but as years actually unfolding. The tree sits there, day after day, sunlight hitting its leaves, water moving through its roots, the slow, steady process of growth happening in a way that looks completely ordinary from the outside. Nothing dramatic, nothing that would suggest anything unusual is going on. 5 years pass. And then Van Helmont does the one thing that matters more than anything else in an experiment like this. He measures again the tree, which started at 5 pounds, now weighs 169 pounds, meaning it gained 164 pounds of mass. Not grew in some abstract sense, but physically increased by 164 pounds of matter that was not there before in that form. So far, that's exactly what you would expect. Trees grow. That part doesn't surprise you. But now comes the part that should completely break your intuition if you're actually paying attention. He takes the soil, dries it again, just like he did at the beginning, and weighs it. And the soil has lost almost nothing. About 2 ounces. That's it. Now, I don't want you to rush past that number, because this is where everything changes. The tree gained 164 pounds, while the soil lost only 2 ounces, which is such a tiny amount compared to the total gain that it might as well be negligible. That is not a small discrepancy that you can explain away with measurement error or experimental noise. That is a complete failure of the idea that the tree's mass comes from the soil. Because if your original explanation were correct, if the tree were built primarily out of the ground, then the numbers would have to reflect that. The soil would need to lose something on the order of 164 pounds to match the gain of the tree. That's not optional. That's required by the conservation of matter. But the numbers don't match, not even close. And this is the moment where you have to make a choice in how you think. You can either ignore the result and keep your original belief because it feels comfortable, or you can accept that your belief has just been tested and failed. And that means you have to let it go. Most people don't let it go. They hear about this experiment. They nod. And then they quietly continue thinking that trees come from the ground. Because changing the way you see something so familiar is harder than it sounds. But you're not going to do that. Because if you take this experiment seriously, then you are forced to accept something very specific and very unsettling. The soil is not the source of the tree's mass, at least not in any significant way. Yes, the tree interacts with the soil. It takes in minerals. It depends on it in certain ways. But those contributions are tiny compared to the total weight of the tree. 2 ounces versus 164 pounds. That ratio should stay in your mind, because it tells you that almost everything you are looking at when you see a tree did not come from the ground it is growing in. So now the situation is no longer just confusing. It is clearly incomplete. You have a massive increase in matter. You have ruled out the most obvious source through direct measurement, and you are left with a gap that your current understanding cannot fill. And that gap is not small. It is almost the entire tree. So now the question becomes sharper than ever, because you no longer have a fallback explanation to retreat to. If the soil does not supply the mass, then the source must be somewhere else, somewhere that can account for hundreds of pounds, even thousands of material. And the strange part, the part that makes this so hard to see, is that the answer has been in front of you the entire time. You just never thought to weigh it. So now you've let go of the first explanation. And that's not a small step, because once you accept that the soil cannot account for the mass of the tree, you're forced to look for another source, something that can supply hundreds or even thousands of pounds of material over time. And almost immediately, your mind reaches for the next most obvious candidate, something that feels even more convincing than the ground ever did. Water. And this time, the idea seems stronger, because unlike soil, you can actually see the process happening. You can picture it clearly. The roots absorb water. The water travels upward through the trunk, spreading into branches and leaves. And the tree grows as this continuous flow moves through it. It feels dynamic, alive. And most importantly, it feels like something that could carry mass into the system in a steady, measurable way. If you've ever watched a plant over time, you know it's constantly interacting with water. A large tree can pull up enormous quantities of it. especially on a hot day. Sometimes tens or even hundreds of gallons moving through its system over years, even decades. That adds up to an immense total. So it's very tempting to say that the missing mass comes from water, that the tree is essentially built out of what it drinks. And I want you to notice how satisfying that explanation feels, because it lines up perfectly with your intuition. You can imagine it happening. You can almost see the water turning into wood as it moves through the plant. It gives you a complete picture. And because the picture is clear, it feels correct. But now we're going to do the same thing we did before. We're going to stop trusting the picture and start asking what it actually means in physical terms. Water is not just stuff. It has a very specific structure. Each molecule is made of 2 hydrogen atoms and 1 oxygen atom, H2O, and those atoms are extremely light, especially hydrogen, which is the lightest element that exists. So if you're claiming that water is the primary source of the tree's mass, then you're also claiming that these hydrogen and oxygen atoms are being rearranged into the material that makes up wood. Now here's where the problem begins to show up. Wood is not made primarily of hydrogen. It's not made primarily of oxygen either. The backbone of wood, the thing that gives it structure and weight, is carbon. Carbon atoms linked together into complex molecules form cellulose and lignin, which make up the bulk of the tree's mass. And carbon is not a minor ingredient here. It accounts for roughly half of the dry weight of a tree. So now you have a mismatch. Water contains no carbon, not a little, not a trace amount, none at all, which means that no matter how much water the tree absorbs, no matter how many gallons flow through its system over time, that water cannot supply the carbon atoms that make up most of the tree's structure. You could pour an ocean through the roots, and you still wouldn't get a single carbon atom out of it. And that's not a small detail you can ignore. That's a complete breakdown of the explanation. Because if the tree is mostly carbon, and your proposed source contains 0 carbon, then it cannot be the source of the mass, no matter how intuitive it feels. The numbers simply do not cooperate with the story. You might try to adjust the idea again, to say that water contributes part of the mass, even if not all of it. But you run into another problem there as well. When water is processed by the tree, it doesn't just get turned into wood. It gets split apart. The hydrogen may be used in certain chemical processes, but the oxygen is largely released back into the atmosphere, which is why plants are responsible for producing much of the oxygen you breathe. So even the water that enters the system does not stay there in a way that would account for the bulk of the tree's mass. And now you're in a familiar position again, but this time it should feel even more uncomfortable, because you've just eliminated the second most obvious answer. The ground doesn't explain it. The water doesn't explain it, and yet the tree is still there, massive and real, with thousands of pounds of material that must have come from somewhere. At this point, the problem is no longer subtle. You are looking at a physical object whose mass cannot be accounted for by the 2 sources you can most easily see going into it. And that should force you to reconsider something deeper, not just about trees, but about how you think about matter itself. Because your intuition keeps pointing you toward things you can see and touch, things that feel substantial, things that seem like they should be the source of something solid. And both times, that intuition has failed. So now you have to ask yourself a different kind of question, one that goes beyond what feels obvious. If the source is not the ground, and it is not the water, then it must be something else, something you have been overlooking, something that is present all the time, surrounding the tree, interacting with it constantly, but so easy to ignore that you never even considered it as a candidate. And the reason you ignored it is not because it's rare or hidden, It's because it doesn't look like anything at all. Now you're in the right state of mind because you've eliminated the answers that felt obvious. And what's left is not clarity, but a kind of tension. A gap in your understanding that refuses to close on its own. You're looking at a massive object, something undeniably real, and you know it gained that mass over time. But the sources you trusted, soil and water, have both failed to explain it in any meaningful way. So now you have to look somewhere else. And this is the part where your intuition is going to resist, because the real answer does not look like the kind of thing that can turn into something solid. It doesn't feel substantial. It doesn't feel like it has weight. In fact, most of the time, you don't even notice it's there. The mass of a tree comes from the air, not metaphorically, not in some abstract ecological sense, but literally, physically, atom by atom. The trunk, the branches, the bark, the roots, almost everything you are looking at when you see a tree is built from a gas that is floating invisibly around it. Carbon dioxide, the same gas you exhale when you breathe, the same gas that makes up only about 4% of the atmosphere. Something so dilute, so easy to ignore, that it barely registers in your awareness as stuff at all. And yet that is the primary source of the solid material that makes up a tree. Now I want you to stop and really think about what that means, because this is where your picture of the world has to change. You are used to thinking that solid things come from other solid things. That wood comes from something dense and tangible, something you can hold in your hand or dig out of the ground. But what's actually happening here is almost the opposite of that intuition. A tree is taking something invisible, something spread thinly through the air, and turning it into something you can touch. This cut and build with it is, in the most literal sense, solidified air. And I'm not using that as a poetic phrase. I mean it physically. The carbon atoms that make up the structure of the tree were once part of carbon dioxide molecules drifting through the atmosphere. They were not in the ground. They were not in the water. They were in the air, moving freely, completely invisible to you. So now the question shifts again, but this time in a more productive direction. How does something that looks like nothing become something that feels solid? The answer begins with the leaves. A tree doesn't just sit there passively. It is constantly interacting with the air around it through tiny openings in its leaves called stomata. And through those openings, carbon dioxide flows into the plant, not in large, dramatic amounts, but continuously, molecule by molecule, over long periods of time. Once inside, something remarkable happens. The tree takes that carbon dioxide molecule, which is stable and content to remain exactly as it is, and it breaks it apart. It strips out the carbon atom, separating it from the oxygen atoms that were bound to it. The oxygen is released back into the air, which is why the air around you remains breathable, but the carbon is kept, and that carbon becomes the raw material, atom by atom. The tree begins to assemble these carbon atoms into larger and more complex structures. It builds molecules like glucose, then links those molecules together into long chains, forming cellulose and lignin, the substances that give wood its strength and rigidity. What started as an invisible gas is now part of a solid structure you can touch. And this process doesn't happen once. It happens continuously, over years, decades, sometimes centuries. The tree is constantly pulling in carbon dioxide, constantly extracting carbon, constantly adding to its own mass. That's where the thousands of pounds come from. Not all at once, but gradually. built up from countless individual molecules that were once floating in the air. So when you stand in front of a tree now, I want you to see something different. You're not looking at the ground standing up. You're not looking at water that somehow turned into wood. You are looking at the atmosphere reorganized into a solid form. You are looking at carbon that was once invisible, now locked into structure through a process that is both simple in its components and extraordinary in its result. And the reason this is so hard to see is not because it's complicated. It's because it violates your expectations. You expect matter to come from things that look like matter. You expect mass to come from things that feel heavy. But here, the source is something you usually ignore entirely, something you treat as empty space. And now you know that it isn't empty at all. It's full of material that trees are quietly, continuously turning into wood. Now that you know where the mass comes from, you might feel like the mystery is solved. But in reality,
Check.
specially structured to absorb certain wavelengths of light. Now here's where something very important happens. When a photon of light is absorbed by a chlorophyll molecule, it transfers its energy to an electron within that molecule, pushing that electron into a higher energy state. That might sound like a small detail, but it's actually the starting point of the entire process, because that energized electron is no longer stable where it is, and it begins to move through a series of other molecules in what is known as an electron transport chain. As that electron moves, it doesn't just wander aimlessly. It drives a sequence of chemical reactions that store energy in a usable form, specifically in molecules like ATP, which act as a kind of energy currency inside the cell. What you have at this stage is something very important. Energy that originally came from sunlight has now been captured and stored in chemical form. And that stored energy is what allows the next step to happen. Because carbon dioxide, the gas you now know is the source of the tree's mass, is an extremely stable molecule. It does not want to break apart on its own. The carbon atom is tightly bound to two oxygen atoms, and separating them requires energy, a lot of it. This is where the stored energy from sunlight is used. The plant takes carbon dioxide molecules and forces them apart, breaking the bonds that hold them together and extracting the carbon atom from each molecule. That carbon is then combined with hydrogen and oxygen in a controlled sequence of reactions to form glucose. A simple sugar with the formula C, 6H12O6. This is the first stage where something that was previously a gas becomes part of a tangible, structured molecule. Now we're starting to see matter take shape. But glucose is not wood. It's just the beginning. The plant then takes these glucose molecules and links them together, forming long chains that become cellulose, the primary structural component of plant cell wall, and lining, which fills in the spaces and gives wood its rigidity and strength. These are large, complex molecules built from repeating units, and they form the physical framework of the tree. And here's the part I want you to really understand, because it ties everything together. The bonds that hold these molecules together, the connections between carbon atoms, between carbon and hydrogen, between all the elements involved, are electromagnetic in nature. The same fundamental force that allowed the chlorophyll molecule to absorb light in the first place is now responsible for holding the structure of the wood together. So if you trace the process all the way back, step by step, what you see is this. Sunlight arrives as electromagnetic energy. That energy is captured and used to break apart carbon dioxide molecules from the air. The carbon atoms are extracted and rearranged into new molecules. And those molecules are assembled into larger structures that become the physical substance of the tree. In other words, energy from the sun is being used to reorganize matter from the atmosphere into solid form. That's not a metaphor. That's the mechanism. And once you see it clearly, the tree stops being just an object and starts looking more like a process. Something that is constantly taking in energy and material from its environment and transforming them into structure. It is not passively existing. It is actively building itself, one molecule at a time, using sunlight as the driving force. So when you look at a tree now, you're not just looking at something that grew. You are looking at stored sunlight, captured over years and converted into chemical bonds, holding together carbon atoms that were once part of invisible gas in the air. And that transformation from light to energy to matter is happening continuously all around you, whether you notice it or not. Now here's the part where the story turns back toward you. Because up to this point, it would be very easy for you to keep this idea at a distance, to think of it as something interesting about trees, something you can admire without letting it change how you see yourself. But if you've really followed the logic, if you've stayed with the question instead of escaping into vague explanations, then you should already feel that this is not just about trees anymore. Because the moment you understand where a tree gets its mass, you are forced to confront a much more uncomfortable and much more interesting realization. The same process applies to you. You eat food every day, and that food is either plants or something that ate plants, or something that ate plants. But no matter how many steps you insert into the chain, it always leads back to the same place. Every calorie you consume, every piece of matter that becomes part of your body, traces back to something that grew by pulling carbon out of the air and using sunlight as the energy source to build it into structure, which means that the carbon in your body right now, the atoms that make up your muscles, your bones, your skin, your brain, all of it, was once part of carbon dioxide floating in the atmosphere, not a long time ago in some abstract sense, but in a very real, physical sequence of events. That carbon was in the air. A plant pulled it in, broke it apart, built it into molecules. Something ate that plant. And eventually...
Okay, Google, add USB-C to USB 3 adapter to my shopping list.
Carbon became part of you. And at some point in the future, it will leave you, returning to the atmosphere to be used by something else. So when you say, this is me, what you are actually pointing to is not a fixed collection of atoms that have always belonged to you, but a temporary arrangement of matter that has been moving through countless other forms long before it reached you and will continue moving long after. And I want you to really sit with that, because it changes the way you see identity at a very fundamental level. You are not made of special permanent material set aside just for you. You are made of the same carbon atoms that have been cycling through the biosphere for billions of years, passing from air to plant to animal and back again, over and over in an ongoing loop that never really stops. The atoms in your body have been part of other organisms, other structures, other systems. And now, for a brief period, they are arranged in a way that you call yourself. And that arrangement is not static. Your body is constantly exchanging matter with its environment. You breathe, you eat, you excrete, you shed cells, you rebuild tissues. And through all of that, atoms are continuously entering and leaving your system over time. A significant portion of the material that makes up your body is replaced, and yet you still experience yourself as the same person. So if the atoms are changing, what exactly is staying the same? This is where the idea becomes deeper than just chemistry, but it is still grounded in physics. What persists is not the specific atom, but the pattern, the structure, the organization of those atoms. You are not the carbon itself. You are the way the carbon is arranged and interacting at any given moment. And that arrangement, just like the tree, is built from the same fundamental process. Carbon taken from the air, assembled into molecules, powered by energy that ultimately comes from the sun, and held together by electromagnetic forces that operate the same way everywhere in the universe. So when you stand next to a tree now, I don't want you to see it as something separate from it, something that grows out of the ground, while you somehow exist independently of that process. I want you to recognize that you and the tree are participating in the same underlying mechanism, just at different stages and in different forms. The tree is pulling carbon out of the air and building structure. You are taking that structure in, rearranging it, and maintaining a different kind of organization, but the raw material is the same. The forces are the same, and the energy source is the same. You are both expressions of the same process. And once you see that clearly, something shifts in how you understand the world. Because the boundary between you and everything else becomes less about what you are made of and more about how that material is temporarily organized. The air, the tree. And you are not separate categories of substance. They are different configurations of the same underlying matter, moving and transforming over time. So the next time you take a breath, or eat a piece of food, or stand under the shade of a tree, I want you to remember what is actually happening at a physical level. You are not just interacting with the world. You are continuously exchanging matter with it, participating in a cycle that connects you directly to the atmosphere, to plants, to sunlight, and to everything that came before. You are not standing outside that system. You are one of the ways it exists.
alright. Yeah, everything's tight, feeling that groove all over my heart. Just make slide, slide, baby, slide. Ooh, the cosmic slide, ain't nowhere to hide. Moving and grooving and grooving, moving and grooving and grooving.
See if there are any YouTube comments that need attention.
Gonna take dashboard, saying things you never should. Left hand on the wheel, right hand drifting out the window. Can't you feel? All the night, try to see slow lanes, but my heart runs ahead of you. Every red light, stretching like cinema. Say my name, let it clear. Old town storefront, radio from the lean, shoulder first. Laugh lines on your face, I'll memorize every cry. You and me on the night drive, slow lane, but my heart runs ahead of you. Every red light, stretching like cinema. Say my name, say my name, let it feel. Come closer. Your sparking, brighter when your fingertips. One small word, then you wipe it when our faces get lost. We stay rolling, maybe time can't catch me. Leave it undefined, but my body already knows. You and me on the night drive, slow, but my heart was ahead of yours. The rain stretching the sea. Say my name, let it clear. Say my name, let it clear.
$0.05. We'll take that.
Corner blue, half like a candle. You trace circles all around your back. and I keep falling for the way you go. That sundown sidewalks way. Record crack, song in the background. You steal always right off my plate. You say you hate when things move too fast, so we stretch every second we can take. You got that sundown sidewalk swing, every step I have to make, and every word I say. You turn the quiet into gold, turn the stories into smoke, and I keep falling for the way you go. Sundown sidewalk swing. Outside the bar, cabs and crosswalks, we take the long way round the block. You talk in circles, I walk in time to the sound of your laugh, running into mine. Oh, you got that sundown sidewalks way, every step I have been hating, and every word I say. You turn the quiet into gold, turn the stories into smoke, and I keep falling for the way you go. That sundown sidewalk sway. Just one more block, one more door, one more slow. Sidewalk sway. Let the night lead in, let the world fall away. Tap your black, leave circles in the low light, laugh in slow motion, lipstick on the lip, just right. Lean on my shoulder, say we're always rushing through, but the clocks have melted when I'm here with you. Slow down, stay in this minute, let the world spin on outside. We got all night in this corner, in that lazy little half smile. Slow down, don't say you're leaving, let your worries miss that flight. Slow down, slow down, till your heartbeat feels like mine.
Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3.
Testing 1, 2, 3. This is turned up all the way. Yes. Okay.